This is a continuation of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie, comprising chapters 18 through 21. Chapter 18. Charles Kent. Half an hour later saw Poirot, myself, and Inspector Raglan in the train on the way to Liverpool. The inspector was clearly very excited. "So we may get a line on the blackmailing part of the business, if on nothing else," he declared jubilantly. "He's a rough customer, this fellow, by what I heard over the phone. Takes dope too. We ought to find it easy to get what we want out of him. If there was the shadow of a motive, nothing's more likely than that he killed Mr. Ackroyd. But in that case, why is young Peyton keeping out of the way? The whole thing's a muddle, that's what it is. By the way, M. Poirot, you were quite right about those fingerprints. They were Mr. Ackroyd's own. I had rather the same idea myself, but I dismissed it as hardly feasible." So smiled to myself. Inspector Raglan was so very plainly saving his face. "As regards this man," said Poirot, "he is not yet arrested, eh?" "No, detained under suspicion." "And what account does he give of himself?" "Precious little," said the inspector with a grin. "He's a wary bird, I gather. A lot of abuse, but very little more." On arrival at Liverpool, I was surprised to find that Poirot was welcomed with acclamation. Superintendent Hayes, who met us, had worked with Poirot over some case long ago, and had evidently an exaggerated opinion of his powers. "Now we've got M. Poirot, here we shan't be long," he said cheerfully. "I thought you'd retired, monsieur." "So I had, my good Hayes, so I had. But how tedious is retirement! You cannot imagine to yourself the monotony with which day comes after day." "Very likely. So you've come to have a look at our own particular find? Is this Dr. Shepherd? Think you'll be able to identify him, sir?" "I'm not very sure," I said doubtfully. "How did you get hold of him?" inquired Poirot. "The description was circulated, as you know, in the press and privately. Not much to go on, I admit. This fellow has an American accent all right, and he doesn't deny that he was near King's Abbot that night. Just asks what the hell it is to do with us, and that he'll see us in before he answers any questions." "Is it permitted that I too see him?" asked Poirot. The superintendent closed one eye knowingly. "Very glad to have you, sir. You've got permission to do anything you please. Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard was asking after you the other day. Said he'd heard you were connected unofficially with this case. Where's Captain Peyton hiding, sir? Can you tell me that?" "I doubt if it would be wise at the present juncture," said Poirot primly, and I bit my lips to prevent a smile. The little man really did it very well. After some further parley, we were taken to interview the prisoner. He was a young fellow, I should say not more than 22 or 3. Tall, thin, with slightly shaking hands, and the evidences of considerable physical strength somewhat run to seed. His hair was dark, but his eyes were blue and shifty, seldom meeting a glance squarely. I had all along cherished the illusion that there was something familiar about the figure I had met that night, but if this were indeed he, I was completely mistaken. He did not remind me in the least of anyone I knew. "Now then, Kent," said the superintendent, "stand up. Here are some visitors come to see you. Recognize any of them?" Kent glared at us sullenly, but did not reply. I saw his glance waver over the 3 of us and come back to rest on me. "Well, sir," said the superintendent to me, "what do you say?" "The height's the same," I said, "and as far as general appearance goes, it might well be the man in question. Beyond that, I couldn't go." "What the hell's the meaning of all this?" asked Kent. "What have you got against me? Come on, out with it. What am I supposed to have done?" I nodded my head. "It's the man," I said. "I recognize the voice." "Recognize my voice, do you? Where do you think you heard it before?" "On Friday evening last, outside the gates of Fernley Park. You asked me the way there." "I did I?" "Do you admit it?" asked the inspector. "I don't admit anything. Not till I know what you've got on me." "Have you not read the papers in the last few days?" asked Poirot, speaking for the first time. The man's eyes narrowed. "So that's it, is it? I saw an old gent had been croaked at Fernley. Trying to make out I did the job, are you?" "You were there that night," said Poirot quietly. "How do you know, mister?" "By this." Poirot took something from his pocket and held it out. It was the goose quill we had found in the summer house. At the sight of it, the man's face changed. He half held out his hand. "Snow," said Poirot thoughtfully. "No, my friend, it is empty. It lay where you dropped it in the summer house that night." Charles Kent looked at him uncertainly. "You seem to know a hell of a lot about everything, you little foreign cock-duck. Perhaps you remember this. The papers say that the old gent was croaked between 9:45 and 10 o'clock. That is so, agreed Poirot. Yes, but is it really so? That's what I'm getting at. This gentleman will tell you, said Poirot. He indicated Inspector Raglan. The latter hesitated, glanced at Superintendent Hayes, then at Poirot, and finally, as though receiving sanction, he said, That's right. Between 9:45 and 10 o'clock. Then you've nothing to keep me here for, said Kent. I was away from Fernley Park by 25 minutes past 9. You can ask at the Dog and Whistle. That's a saloon about a mile out of Fernley on the road to Cranchester. I kicked up a bit of a row there, I remember. As near as nothing to 9:45, it was. How about that? Inspector Raglan wrote down something in his notebook. Well, demanded Kent. Inquiries will be made, said the inspector. If you've spoken the truth, you won't have anything to complain about. What were you doing at Fernley Park anyway? I went there to meet someone. Who? I. That's none of your business. You'd better keep a civil tongue in your head, my man, the superintendent warned him. To hell with a civil tongue. I went there on my own business, and that's all there is to it. If I was clear away before the murder was done, that's all that concerns the cops. Your name, it is Charles Kent, said Poirot. Where were you born? The man stared at him, then he grinned. I'm a full-blown Britisher all right, he said. Yes, said Poirot meditatively, I think you are. I fancy you were born in Kent. The man stared. Why's that? Because of my name. What's that to do with it? Is a man whose name is Kent bound to be born in that particular county? Under certain circumstances, I can imagine he might be, said Poirot very deliberately. Under certain circumstances, you comprehend. There was so much meaning in his voice as to surprise the two police officers. As for Charles Kent, he flushed a brick red, and for a moment I thought he was going to spring at Poirot. He thought better of it, however, and turned away with a weak kind of laugh. Poirot nodded as though satisfied, and made his way out through the door. He was joined presently by the two officers. And we'll verify that statement, remarked Raglan. I don't think he's lying, though, but he's got to come clear with a statement as to what he was doing at Fernley. It looks to me as though we'd got our blackmailer all right. On the other hand, granted his story's correct, he couldn't have had anything to do with the actual murder. He'd got £10 on him when he was arrested, rather a large sum. I fancy that £40 went to it. The numbers of the notes didn't correspond, but of course he'd have changed them first thing. So Mr. Ackroyd must have given him the money, and he made off with it as fast as possible. What was that about Kent being his birthplace? What's that got to do with it? Nothing whatever, said Poirot mildly. A little idea of mine, that was all. Me, I am famous for my little ideas. Are you really? Said Raglan, studying him with a puzzled expression. The superintendent went into a roar of laughter. So many's the time I've heard Inspector Japp say that. M. Poirot and his little ideas. Too fanciful for me, he'd say, but always something in them. You mock yourself at me, said Poirot, smiling, but never mind. The old ones they laugh last sometimes, when the young, clever ones do not laugh at all. And nodding his head at them in a sage manner, he walked out into the street. He and I lunched together at an hotel. I know now that the whole thing lay clearly unraveled before him, when he had got the last thread he needed to lead him to the truth. But at the time I had no suspicion of the fact. I overestimated his general self-confidence, and I took it for granted that the things which puzzled me must be equally puzzling to him. My chief puzzle was what the man Charles Kent could have been doing at Fernley. Again and again I put the question to myself, and could get no satisfactory reply. At last I ventured a tentative query to Poirot. His reply was immediate. Mon ami, I do not think I know. Really, I said incredulously. Else indeed, I suppose now that to you it would not make sense if I said that he went to Fernley that night because he was born in Kent. I stared at him. It certainly doesn't seem to make sense to me, I said dryly. Ah, said Poirot pityingly. Well, no matter. I have still my little idea. Chapter 19. Flora Ackroyd. As I was returning from my round the following morning, I was hailed by Inspector Raglan. I pulled up, and the inspector mounted on the step. Good morning, Dr. Shepherd, he said. Well, that alibi's all right enough, Iquisro. Charles Kent's. The barmaid at the Dog and Whistle, Sally Jones, she remembers him perfectly. It picked out his photograph from among 5 others. It was just 9:45 when he came into the bar, and the Dog and Whistle is well over a mile from Fernley Park. The girl mentions that he had a lot of money on him. She saw him take a handful of notes out of his pocket. Rather surprised her, it did, seeing the class of fellow he was, with a pair of boots clean dropping off him. That's where that £40 went right enough. The man still refuses to give an account of his visit to Fernley? Obstinate as a mule he is. I had a chat with Hayes at Liverpool over the wire this morning. Hercule Poirot says he knows the reason the man went there that night, I observed. Does he? Cried the inspector eagerly. Yes, I said maliciously. He says he went there because he was born in Kent. And I felt a distinct pleasure in passing on my own discomfiture. Raglan stared a moment or two uncomprehendingly. Then a grin overspread his weaselly countenance, and he tapped his forehead significantly. Bit gone here, he said. I've thought so for some time. Poor old chap, so that's why he had to give up and come down here. In the family, very likely. He's got a nephew who's quite off his crumpet. Poirot has, I said, very surprised. Gilles, hasn't he ever mentioned him to you? Quite docile, I believe. And all that, but mad as a hatter, poor lad. Who told you that? Again a grin showed itself on Inspector Raglan's face. Your sister, Miss Shepherd, she told me all about it. Really, Caroline is amazing. She never rests until she knows the last details of everybody's family secrets. Unfortunately, I have never been able to instill into her the decency of keeping them to herself. I jump in, Inspector, I said, opening the door of the car. We'll go up to the Larches together and acquaint our Belgian friend with the latest news. Might as well, I suppose. After all, even if he is a bit balmy, it was a useful tip he gave me about those fingerprints. Yet he's got a bee in his bonnet about the man Kent, but who knows, there may be something useful behind it. Poirot received us with his usual smiling courtesy. He listened to the information we had brought him, nodding his head now and then. Seems quite okay, doesn't it? Said the inspector rather gloomily. A chap can't be murdering someone in one place when he's drinking in the bar in another place a mile away. Are you going to release him? Don't see what else we can do. We can't very well hold him for obtaining money on false pretenses. Can't prove a ruddy thing. The inspector tossed a match into the grate in a disgruntled fashion. Poirot retrieved it and put it neatly in a little receptacle designed for the purpose. His action was purely mechanical. I could see that his thoughts were on something very different. If I were you, he said at last, I should not release the man Charles Kent yet. What do you mean? Raglan stared at him. Just what I say. I should not release him yet. But you don't think he can have had anything to do with the murder, do you? I think probably not, but one cannot be certain yet. But haven't I just told you? Poirot raised a hand protestingly. Mais oui, I heard. I am not deaf nor stupid, thank God. But see you approach the matter from the wrong premises, is not that the word? The inspector stared at him heavily. I don't see how you make that out. Look here, we know Mr. Ackroyd was alive at 9:45. You admit that, don't you? Poirot looked at him for a moment, then shook his head with a quick smile. I admit nothing that is not proved. Well, we've got proof enough of that. We've got Miss Flora Ackroyd's evidence. That she said good night to her uncle. But me, I do not always believe what a young lady tells me, no, not even when she is charming and beautiful. But hang it all, man, Parker saw her coming out of the door. No, Poirot's voice rang out with sudden sharpness. That is just what he did not see. I satisfied myself of that by a little experiment the other day, you remember, Doctor. Parker saw her outside the door, with her hand on the handle. He did not see her come out of the room. But where else could she have been? Perhaps on the stairs. The stairs. That is my little idea, yes. But those stairs only lead to Mr. Ackroyd's bedroom. Precisely. And still the inspector stared. If you think she'd been up to her uncle's bedroom, well, why not? Why should she lie about it? That is just the question. It depends on what she was doing there, does it not? You mean the money? Hang it all, you don't suggest that it was Miss Ackroyd who took that £40. I suggest nothing, said Poirot. But I will remind you of this. Life was not very easy for that mother and daughter. There were bills, there was constant trouble over small sums of money. Roger Ackroyd was a peculiar man over money matters. The girl might be at her wit's end for a comparatively small sum. Figure to yourself then what happens. She has taken the money, she descends the little staircase. When she is halfway down, she hears the chink of glass from the hall. She has not a doubt of what it is, Parker coming to the study. At all costs she must not be found on the stairs. Parker will not forget it. He will think it odd. If the money is missed, Parker is sure to remember having seen her come down those stairs. She has just time to rush down to the study door with her hand on the handle to show that she has just come out, when Parker appears in the doorway. She says the first thing that comes into her head, a repetition of Roger Ackroyd's orders earlier in the evening, and then goes upstairs to her own room. Yes, but later, persisted the inspector, she must have realized the vital importance of speaking the truth, to why the whole case hinges on it. Afterwards, said Poirot dryly, it was a little difficult for Mademoiselle Flora. She is told simply that the police are here, and that there has been a robbery. Naturally, she jumps to the conclusion that the theft of the money has been discovered. But her one idea is to stick to her story. When she learns that her uncle is dead, she is panic-stricken. Well, young women do not faint nowadays, monsieur, without considerable provocation. Eh bien, there it is. She is bound to stick to her story, or else confess everything. And a young and pretty girl does not like to admit that she is a thief, especially before those whose esteem she is anxious to retain. The Raglan brought his fist down with a thump on the table. I'll not believe it, he said. It's not credible. And you've known this all along. The possibility has been in my mind from the first, admitted Poirot. I was always convinced that Mademoiselle Flora was hiding something from us. To satisfy myself, I made the little experiment I told you of. Dr. Shepherd accompanied me. A test for Parker, you said it was, I remarked bitterly. Mon ami, said Poirot apologetically, as I told you at the time, one must say something. The inspector rose. There's only one thing for it, he declared. We must tackle the young lady right away. You'll come up to Fernley with me, Ma'am Poirot. Certainly, Dr. Shepherd will drive us up in his car. I acquiesced willingly. On inquiry for Miss Ackroyd, we were shown into the billiard room. Flora and Major Hector Blunt were sitting on the long window seat. Good morning, Miss Ackroyd, said the inspector. Can we have a word or two alone with you? Blunt got up at once and moved to the door. What is it? Asked Flora nervously. Don't go, Major Blunt. He can stay, can't he? She asked, turning to the inspector. That's as you like, said the inspector dryly. There's a question or two it's my duty to put to you, miss, but I'd prefer to do so privately, and I dare say you'd prefer it also. Flora looked keenly at him. I saw her face grow whiter. Then she turned and spoke to Blunt. I want you to stay, please. Yes, I mean it. Whatever the inspector has to say to me, I'd rather you heard it. Raglan shrugged his shoulders. Well, if you will have it so, that's all there is to it. Now, Miss Ackroyd, Mem Poirot here has made a certain suggestion to me. He suggests that you weren't in the study at all last Friday night, that you never saw Mr. Ackroyd to say good night to him, that instead of being in the study you were on the stairs leading down from your uncle's bedroom when you heard Parker coming across the hall. Flora's gaze shifted to Poirot. He nodded back at her. Mademoiselle, the other day, when we sat round the table, I implored you to be frank with me. What one does not tell to Papa Poirot he finds out. It was that, was it not? See, I will make it easy for you. You took the money, did you not? The money, said Blunt sharply. There was a silence which lasted for at least a minute. Then Flora drew herself up and spoke. My Poirot is right. I took that money. I stole. I am a thief, yes, a common vulgar little thief. Now you know. I am glad it has come out. It's been a nightmare these last few days. She sat down suddenly and buried her face in her hands. She spoke huskily through her fingers. They don't know what my life has been since I came here, wanting things, scheming for them, lying, cheating, running up bills, promising to pay. Oh, I hate myself when I think of it all. That's what brought us together, Ralph and I. We were both weak. I understood him, and I was sorry because I'm the same underneath. We're not strong enough to stand alone, either of us. We're weak, miserable, despicable things. She looked at Blunt and suddenly stamped her foot. Why do you look at me like that, as though you couldn't believe? I may be a thief, but at any rate I'm real now. I'm not lying anymore. I'm not pretending to be the kind of girl you like, young and innocent and simple. I don't care if you never want to see me again. I hate myself, despise myself, but you've got to believe one thing. If speaking the truth would have made things better for Ralph, I would have spoken out. But I've seen all along that it wouldn't be better for Ralph. It makes the case against him blacker than ever. I was not doing him any harm by sticking to my lie. Ralph, said Blunt. I see always Ralph. If you don't understand, said Flora hopelessly, you never will. She turned to the inspector. I admit everything. I was at my wit's end for money. I never saw my uncle that evening after he left the dinner table. As to the money, you can take what steps you please. Nothing could be worse than it is now. Suddenly she broke down again, hid her face in her hands, and rushed from the room. Well, said the inspector in a flat tone, so that's that? He seemed rather at a loss what to do next. Blunt came forward. Inspector Raglan, he said quietly, that money was given to me by Mr. Ackroyd for a special purpose. Miss Ackroyd never touched it. When she says she did, she is lying with the idea of shielding Captain Peyton. The truth is, as I said, and I am prepared to go into the witness box and swear to it." He made a kind of jerky bow, then turning abruptly he left the room. Poirot was after him in a flash. He caught the other up in the hall. "Monsieur, a moment, I beg of you, if you will be so good." "Well, sir?" Blunt was obviously impatient. He stood frowning down on Poirot. "It is this," said Poirot rapidly. "I am not deceived by your little fantasy." "No, indeed." "It was truly Miss Flora who took the money. All the same, it is well imagined what you say. It pleases me. What is very good what you have done there. You are a man quick to think and to act." "I'm not in the least anxious for your opinion, thank you," said Blunt coldly. He made once more as though to pass on, but Poirot, not at all offended, laid a detaining hand on his arm. "Ah, but you are to listen to me. I have more to say. The other day I spoke of concealments. Very well, all along have I seen what you are concealing. Mademoiselle Flora, you love her with all your heart. From the first moment you saw her, is it not so? Oh, let us not mind saying these things. Why must one in England think it necessary to mention love as though it were some disgraceful secret? You love Mademoiselle Flora. You seek to conceal that fact from all the world. That is very good, that is as it should be. But take the advice of Hercule Poirot, do not conceal it from Mademoiselle herself." Blunt had shown several signs of restlessness whilst Poirot was speaking, but the closing words seemed to rivet his attention. "What do you mean by that?" he said sharply. "Did you think that she loves the Capitaine Ralph Peyton, but I, Hercule Poirot, tell you that that is not so. Mademoiselle Flora accepted Captain Peyton to please her uncle, and because she saw in the marriage a way of escape from her life here which was becoming frankly insupportable to her. She liked him, and there was much sympathy and understanding between them, but love no. It is not Captain Peyton Mademoiselle Flora loves." "What the devil do you mean?" asked Blunt. I saw the dark flush under his tan. "You have been blind, monsieur. Blind. She is loyal, the little one. Ralph Peyton is under a cloud. She is bound in honor to stick by him. I felt it was time I put in a word to help on the good work." "And my sister told me the other night," I said encouragingly, "that Flora had never cared a penny piece for Ralph Peyton, and never would. My sister is always right about these things." Blunt ignored my well-meant efforts. He spoke to Poirot. "Do you really think he began and stopped?" "He is one of those inarticulate men who find it hard to put things into words. Poirot knows no such disability. If you doubt me, ask her yourself, monsieur, but perhaps you no longer care to the affair of the money." Blunt gave a sound like an angry laugh. "Think I'd hold that against her. Roger was always a queer chap about money. She got in a mess and didn't dare tell him. Poor kid. Poor lonely kid." Poirot looked thoughtfully at the side door. "Till Mademoiselle Flora went into the garden, I think," he murmured. "I've been every kind of a fool," said Blunt abruptly. "Rum conversation we've been having. Like one of those Danish plays. But you're a sound fellow, M. Poirot, thank you." He took Poirot's hand and gave it a grip which caused the other to wince in anguish. Then he strode to the side door and passed out into the garden. "Not every kind of a fool," murmured Poirot, tenderly nursing the injured member. "Only one kind, the fool in love." Chapter 20. Miss Russell. Inspector Raglan had received a bad jolt. He was not deceived by Blunt's valiant lie any more than we had been. Our way back to the village was punctuated by his complaints. "This alters everything, this does. I don't know whether you've realized it, Monsieur Poirot." "And I think so, yes, I think so," said Poirot. "You see, I have been familiar with the idea for some time." Inspector Raglan, who had only had the idea presented to him a short half-hour ago, looked at Poirot unhappily, and went on with his discoveries. "Those alibis now, worthless, absolutely worthless. Got to start again. Find out what everyone was doing from 9:30 onwards. 9:30, that's the time we've got to hang on to. You were quite right about the man Kent, we don't release him yet a while. Well, let me see now, 9:45 at the Dog and Whistle. He might have got there in a quarter of an hour if he ran. It's just possible that it was his voice Mr. Raymond heard talking to Mr. Ackroyd asking for money which Mr. Ackroyd refused. But one thing's clear, it wasn't he who sent the telephone message. The station is half a mile in the other direction, over a mile and a half from the Dog and Whistle, and he was at the Dog and Whistle until about 10 minutes past 10. Dang that telephone call, we always come up against it." "We do indeed," agreed Poirot. "It is curious. It's just possible that if Captain Peyton climbed into his uncle's room and found him there murdered, he may have sent it. I got the wind up, thought he'd be accused and cleared out. That's possible, isn't it?" "Why should he have telephoned?" "May have had doubts if the old man was really dead. Thought he'd get the doctor up there as soon as possible, but didn't want to give himself away. Yes, I say now, how's that for a theory? Something in that, I should say. The inspector swelled his chest out importantly. He was so plainly delighted with himself that any words of ours would have been quite superfluous. So we arrived back at my house at this minute, and I hurried into my surgery patients, who had all been waiting a considerable time, leaving Poirot to walk to the police station with the inspector. Having dismissed the last patient, I strolled into the little room at the back of the house which I call my workshop. I am rather proud of the home-made wireless set I turned out. Caroline hates my workroom. I keep my tools there, and Annie is not allowed to wreak havoc with a dustpan and brush. I was just adjusting the interior of an alarm clock which had been denounced as wholly unreliable by the household, when the door opened and Caroline put her head. "Oh, there you are, Jane," she said with deep disapproval, "and Poirot wants to see you." "Well," I said, rather irritably, for her sudden entrance had startled me and I had let go of a piece of delicate mechanism. "If he wants to see me, he can come in here." "In here," said Caroline. "That's what I said, in here." Caroline gave a sniff of disapproval and retired. She returned in a moment or two, ushering in Poirot, and then retired again, shutting the door with a bang. "Aha, my friend," said Poirot, coming forward and rubbing his hands. "You have not got rid of me so easily, you see." "Finished with the inspector?" I asked. "For the moment, yes. And you have seen all the patients." "Yes. Ice." Poirot sat down and looked at me, tilting his egg-shaped head on one side, with the air of one who savors a very delicious joke. "So you are in error," he said at last. "You have still one patient to see." "Not you?" I exclaimed in surprise. "Ah, not me, by an intendo. Me, I have the health magnificent. No, to tell you the truth, it is a little complot of mine. There is someone I wish to see, you understand, and at the same time it is not necessary that the whole village should intrigue itself about the matter, which is what would happen if the lady were seen to come to my house, for it is a lady. But to you she has already come as a patient before." "Miss Russell," I exclaimed. "Precisement. I wish much to speak with her, so I send her the little note and make the appointment in your surgery. You are not annoyed with me?" "On the contrary," I said. "That is, presuming I am allowed to be present at the interview?" "But naturally, in your own surgery." "You know," I said, throwing down the pincers I was holding, "it's extraordinarily intriguing, the whole thing. Every new development that arises is like the shake you give to a kaleidoscope. The thing changes entirely in aspect. Now, why are you so anxious to see Miss Russell?" Poirot raised his eyebrows. "Surely it is obvious," he murmured. "There you go again," I grumbled. "According to you everything is obvious. But you leave me walking about in a fog." Poirot shook his head genially at me. "You mock yourself at me. Take the matter of Mademoiselle Flora. The inspector was surprised, but you were not." "I never dreamed of her being the thief," I expostulated. "That perhaps no. But I was watching your face and you were not like Inspector Raglan, startled and incredulous." I thought for a minute or two. "Perhaps you are right," I said at last. "All along I felt that Flora was keeping back something, so the truth, when it came, was subconsciously expected. It upset Inspector Raglan very much indeed, poor man." "Ah, poor away. The poor man must rearrange all his ideas. I profited by his state of mental chaos to induce him to grant me a little favor." "What was that?" Poirot took a sheet of notepaper from his pocket. Some words were written on it, and he read them aloud. "The police have for some days been seeking for Captain Ralph Peyton, the nephew of Mr. Ackroyd of Fernley Park, whose death occurred under such tragic circumstances last Friday. Captain Peyton has been found at Liverpool, where he was on the point of embarking for America." He folded up the piece of paper again. "That, my friend, will be in the newspapers tomorrow morning." I stared at him, dumbfounded. But it isn't true. He's not at Liverpool." Poirot beamed on me. "You have the intelligence so quick. No, he has not been found at Liverpool. Inspector Raglan was very loath to let me send this paragraph to the press, especially as I could not take him into my confidence. But I assured him most solemnly that very interesting results would follow its appearance in print, so he gave in, after stipulating that he was, on no account, to bear the responsibility." I stared at Poirot. He smiled back at me. "So it beats me," I said at last, "what you expect to get out of that." "You should employ your little gray cells," said Poirot gravely. He rose and came across to the bench. "It is that you have really the love of the machinery," he said, after inspecting the debris of my labors. "Every man has his hobby." I immediately drew Poirot's attention to my homemade wireless. Finding him sympathetic, I showed him one or two little inventions of my own, trifling things, but useful in the house. "Decidedly," said Poirot, "you should be an inventor by trade, not a doctor. But I hear the bell that is your patient. Let us go into the surgery." Once before I had been struck by the remnants of beauty in the housekeeper's face, so this morning I was struck anew. Very simply dressed in black, tall, upright, and independent as ever, with her big dark eyes and an unwanted flush of color in her usually pale cheeks, I realized that as a girl she must have been startlingly handsome. "Good morning, mademoiselle," said Poirot. "Will you be seated? Dr. Shepherd is so kind as to permit me the use of his surgery for a little conversation I am anxious to have with you." So Miss Russell sat down with her usual composure. If she felt any inward agitation, it did not display itself in any outward manifestation. "It seems a queer way of doing things, if you'll allow me to say so," she remarked. "Miss Russell, I have news to give you." "Indeed." "Charles Kent has been arrested at Liverpool." Not a muscle of her face moved. She merely opened her eyes a trifle wider and asked, with a tinge of defiance, "Well, what of it?" But at that moment it came to me the resemblance that had haunted me all along, something familiar in the defiance of Charles Kent's manner. The two voices, one rough and coarse, the other painfully lay-like, were strangely the same in timbre. It was of Miss Russell that I had been reminded that night outside the gates of Fernley Park. I looked at Poirot, full of my discovery, and he gave me an imperceptible nod. In answer to Miss Russell's question, he threw out his hands in a thoroughly French gesture. "I thought you might be interested, that is all," he said mildly. "So well, not particularly," said Miss Russell. "Who is this Charles Kent anyway?" "He is a man, mademoiselle, who was at Fernley on the night of the murder." "Really?" "Fortunately for him, he has an alibi. At 9:45 he was at a public house a mile from here." "Lucky for him," commented Miss Russell. "Though we still do not know what he was doing at Fernley, who it was he went to meet, for instance." "I'm afraid I can't help you at all," said the housekeeper politely. "Nothing came to my ears, if that is all." She made a tentative movement as though to rise. Poirot stopped her. "It is not quite all," he said smoothly. "This morning fresh developments have arisen. It seems now that Mr. Ackroyd was murdered, not at 9:45, but before, between 10 minutes to 9, when Dr. Shepherd left, and 9:45. I saw the color drain from the housekeeper's face, leaving it dead white. She leaned forward, her figure swaying. "But Miss Ackroyd said. Miss Ackroyd has admitted that she was lying. She was never in the study at all that evening." "Then?" "Fine. Then it would seem that in this Charles Kent we have the man we are looking for. He came to Fernley, can give no account of what he was doing there." "I can tell you what he was doing there. He never touched a hair of old Ackroyd's head. He never went near the study. He didn't do it, I tell you." She was leaning forward. That iron self-control was broken through at last. Terror and desperation were in her face. "Mais Poirot. M. Poirot. Oh, do believe me." Poirot got up and came to her. He patted her reassuringly on the shoulder. But yes, I will believe. I had to make you speak, you know." For an instant suspicion flared up in her. "Is what you said true?" "That Charles Kent is suspected of the crime. Yes, that is true. You alone can save him by telling the reason for his being at Fernley." "He came to see me." She spoke in a low, hurried voice. "I went out to meet him." "In the summer house, yes, I know." "How do you know?" "Mademoiselle, it is the business of Hercule Poirot to know things. I know that you went out earlier in the evening, that you left a message in the summer house to say what time you would be there." "Yes, I did. I had heard from him saying he was coming. I dared not let him come to the house. And I wrote to the address he gave me and said I would meet him in the summer house, and described it to him so that he would be able to find it. Then I was afraid he might not wait there patiently, and I ran out and left a piece of paper to say I would be there about 10 minutes past 9. I didn't want the servants to see me, so I slipped out through the drawing-room window. As I came back, I met Dr. Shepherd, and I fancied that he would think it queer. I was out of breath, for I had been running. I had no idea that he was expected to dinner that night." She paused. "Go on," said Poirot. "You went out to meet him at 10 minutes past 9. What did you say to each other?" "It's difficult, you see." "Mademoiselle," said Poirot, interrupting her, "in this matter I must have the whole truth. What you tell us need never go beyond these 4 walls. Dr. Shepherd will be discreet, and so shall I. See, I will help you. This Charles Kent, he is your son, is he not?" She nodded. The color had flamed into her cheeks. "No one has ever known. It was long ago down in Kent. I was not married." So you took the name of the county as a surname for him. I understand. I got work. I managed to pay for his board and lodging. I never told him that I was his mother. But he turned out badly. He drank, then took to drugs. I managed to pay his passage out to Canada. And I didn't hear of him for a year or two. Then, somehow or other, he found out that I was his mother. He wrote asking me for money. Finally, I heard from him back in this country again. When he was coming to see me at Fernley, he said, I dared not let him come to the house. I have always been considered so very respectable. If anyone got an inkling, it would have been all up with my post as housekeeper. So I wrote to him in the way I have just told you. And in the morning you came to see Dr. Shepherd. Yes, I wondered if something could be done. He was not a bad boy before he took to drugs. I see, said Poirot. Now let us go on with the story. He came that night to the summer house? Yes, he was waiting for me when I got there. He was very rough and abusive. I had brought with me all the money I had, and I gave it to him. We talked a little, and then he went away. What time was that? It must have been between 20 and 25 minutes past 9. It was not yet 1:30 when I got back to the house. Which way did he go? Straight out the same way he came, by the path that joined the drive just inside the lodge gates. Poirot nodded. And you, what did you do? I went back to the house. Major Blunt was walking up and down the terrace smoking, so I made a detour to get round to the side door. It was then just on 9:30, as I tell you. Poirot nodded again. He made a note or two in a microscopic pocketbook. I think that is all, he said thoughtfully. She hesitated. Ought I to tell all this to Inspector Raglan? It may come to that. But let us not be in a hurry. Let us proceed slowly, with due order and method. Charles Kent is not yet formally charged with murder. Circumstances may arise which will render your story unnecessary. Miss Russell rose. Thank you very much, M. Poirot, she said. You have been very kind indeed. You do believe me, don't you, that Charles had nothing to do with this wicked murder? There seems no doubt that the man who was talking to Mr. Ackroyd in the library at 9:30 could not possibly have been your son. To be of good courage, mademoiselle. All will yet be well. Miss Russell departed. Poirot and I were left together. So that's that, I said. Every time we come back to Ralph Peyton, how did you manage to spot Miss Russell as the person Charles Kent came to meet? Did you notice the resemblance? I had connected her with the unknown man long before we actually came face to face with him. As soon as we found that quill, the quill suggested dope, and I remembered your account of Miss Russell's visit to you. Then I found the article on cocaine in that morning's paper. It all seemed very clear. She had heard from someone that morning, someone addicted to drugs. She read the article in the paper, and she came to you to ask a few tentative questions. She mentioned cocaine since the article in question was on cocaine. Then, when you seemed too interested, she switched hurriedly to the subject of detective stories and untraceable poisons. I suspected a son or a brother or some other undesirable male relation. But I must go. It is the time of the lunch. Stay and lunch with us, I suggested. Poirot shook his head. A faint twinkle came into his eye. Not again today. I should not like to force Mademoiselle Caroline to adopt a vegetarian diet 2 days in succession. It occurred to me that there was not much which escaped Hercule Poirot. Chapter 21. The paragraph in the paper. Caroline, of course, had not failed to see Miss Russell come to the surgery door. I had anticipated this, and had ready an elaborate account of the lady's bad knee. But Caroline was not in a cross-questioning mood. Her point of view was that she knew what Miss Russell had really come for, and that I didn't. Pumping you, James, said Caroline. Pumping you in the most shameless manner, I've not a doubt. That's no good interrupting. I dare say you hadn't the least idea she was doing it even. Men are so simple. She knows that you were in M. Poirot's confidence, and she wants to find out things. Do you know what I think, James? I couldn't begin to imagine. You think so many extraordinary things. It's no good being sarcastic. I think Miss Russell knows more about Mr. Ackroyd's death than she is prepared to admit. Caroline leaned back triumphantly in her chair. Do you really think so? I said absently. You are very dull today, James. No animation about you. It's that liver of yours. Our conversation then dealt with purely personal matters. The paragraph inspired by Poirot duly appeared in our daily paper the next morning. I was in the dark as to its purpose, but its effect on Caroline was immense. When she began by stating most untruly that she had said as much all along, I raised my eyebrows but did not argue. Caroline, however, must have felt a prick of conscience, for she went on. I mayn't have actually mentioned Liverpool, but I knew he'd try to get away to America. That's what Crippen did. But without much success, I reminded her. Poor boy, and so they've caught him. I consider, James, that it's your duty to see that he isn't hung. What do you expect me to do? Why, you're a medical man, aren't you? You've known him from a boy upwards. Not mentally responsible. That's the line to take, clearly. I read only the other day that they're very happy in Broadmoor. It's quite like a high-class club. But Caroline's words had reminded me of something. I never knew that Poirot had an imbecile nephew, I said curiously. Didn't you? Oh, he told me all about it. Poor lad. It's a great grief to all the family. They've kept him at home so far, but it's getting to such a pitch that they're afraid he'll have to go into some kind of institution. I suppose you know pretty well everything there is to know about Poirot's family by this time, I said, exasperated. Pretty well, said Caroline complacently. It's a great relief to people to be able to tell all their troubles to someone. It might be, I said, if they were ever allowed to do so spontaneously. Whether they enjoy having confidences screwed out of them by force is another matter. Caroline merely looked at me with the air of a Christian martyr gustiaing martyrdom. Would you are so self-contained, James, she said. You hate speaking out or parting with any information yourself, and you think everybody else must be just like you. I should hope that I never screw confidences out of anybody. For instance, if Poirot comes in this afternoon, as he said he might do, I shall not dream of asking him who it was arrived at his house early this morning. Early this morning? I queried. Very early, said Caroline. Before the milk came. I just happened to be looking out of the window. The blind was flapping. It was a man. He came in a closed car, and he was all muffled up. I couldn't get a glimpse of his face. But I will tell you my idea, and you'll see that I'm right. What's your idea? Caroline dropped her voice mysteriously. The Home Office expert? She breathed. A Home Office expert, I said, amazed. My dear Caroline. Mark my words, James, you'll see that I'm right. That Russell woman was here that morning after your poisons. Roger Ackroyd might easily have been poisoned in his food that night. I laughed out loud. Nonsense, I cried. He was stabbed in the neck. You know that as well as I do. After death, James, said Caroline, to make a false clue. My good woman, I said, I examined the body and I know what I'm talking about. That wound wasn't inflicted after death, it was the cause of death, and you need make no mistake about it. Caroline merely continued to look omniscient, which so annoyed me that I went on. Perhaps you will tell me, Caroline, if I have a medical degree or if I have not. You have the medical degree, I dare say, James, at least. I know you have. But you've no imagination whatever. Having endowed you with a treble portion, there was none left over for me, I said dryly. I was amused to notice Caroline's maneuvers that afternoon when Poirot duly arrived. My sister, without asking a direct question, skirted the subject of the mysterious guest in every way imaginable. By the twinkle in Poirot's eyes, I saw that he realized her object. He remained blandly impervious, and blocked her bowling so successfully that she herself was at a loss how lost. Having, I suspect, quietly enjoyed the little game, he rose to his feet and suggested a walk. It is that I need to reduce the figure a little, he explained. You will come with me, doctor. And perhaps later Miss Caroline will give us some tea. Delighted, said Caroline. Won't your guest come in also? You are too kind, said Poirot. But no, my friend reposes himself. Soon you must make his acquaintance. Quite an old friend of yours, so somebody told me, said Caroline, making one last valiant effort. Did they? Murmured Poirot. Well, we must start. And our tramp took us in the direction of Fernley. I had guessed beforehand that it might do so. But I was beginning to understand Poirot's methods. Every little irrelevancy had a bearing upon the whole. I have a commission for you, my friend, he said at last. Tonight, at my house, I desire to have a little conference. You will attend, will you not? Certainly, I said. Good. I need also all those in the house, that is to say, Mrs. Ackroyd, Mademoiselle Flora, Major Blunt, M. Raymond. I want you to be my ambassador. This little reunion is fixed for 9 o'clock. You will ask them, yes? With pleasure, but why not ask them yourself? Because they will then put the questions, why, what for? They will demand what my idea is. And, as you know, my friend, I much dislike to have to explain my little ideas until the time comes. I smiled a little. My friend Hastings, he of whom I told you, used to say of me that I was the human oyster. But he was unjust. Of facts I keep nothing to myself, but to everyone his own interpretation of them. When do you want me to do this? Now, if you will, we are close to the house. Aren't you coming in? No, me, I will promenade myself in the grounds. I will rejoin you by the lodge gates in a quarter of an hour's time." I nodded and set off on my task. The only member of the family at home proved to be Mrs. Ackroyd, who was sipping an early cup of tea. She received me very graciously. "So grateful to you, Doctor," she murmured, "for clearing up that little matter with Poirot. But life is one trouble after another. You have heard about Flora, of course." "So what exactly?" I asked cautiously. "This new engagement. Flora and Hector Blunt. Of course not such a good match as Ralph would have been. But after all, happiness comes first. What dear Flora needs is an older man, someone steady and reliable, and then Hector is really a very distinguished man in his way. You saw the news of Ralph's arrest in the paper this morning." "Yes," I said, "I did." "Horrible." Mrs. Ackroyd closed her eyes and shuddered. Geoffrey Raymond was in a terrible way. Rang up Liverpool. But they wouldn't tell him anything at the police station there. In fact, they said they hadn't arrested Ralph at all. Mr. Raymond insists that it's all a mistake, a what do they call it? Canard of the newspapers. I've forbidden it to be mentioned before the servants. Such a terrible disgrace. Fancy if Flora had actually been married to him. Mrs. Ackroyd shut her eyes in anguish. I began to wonder how soon I should be able to deliver Poirot's invitation. Before I had time to speak, Mrs. Ackroyd was off again. "You were here yesterday, weren't you, with that dreadful Inspector Raglan? Brute of a man, he terrified Flora into saying she took that money from poor Roger's room. And the matter was so simple, really. The dear child wanted to borrow a few pounds, didn't like to disturb her uncle since he'd given strict orders against it, but knowing where he kept his notes, she went there and took what she needed." "Is that Flora's account of the matter?" I asked. "My dear doctor, you know what girls are nowadays, so easily acted on by suggestion. You, of course, know all about hypnosis and that sort of thing. The inspector shouts at her, says the words steal over and over again, until the poor child gets an inhibition, or is it a complex? I always mix up those two words, and actually thinks herself that she has stolen the money. I saw at once how it was. But I can't be too thankful for the whole misunderstanding. In one way it seems to have brought those two together, Hector and Flora. And I assure you that I have been very much worried about Flora in the past. Why, at one time I actually thought there was going to be some kind of understanding between her and young Raymond. Just think of it." Mrs. Ackroyd's voice rose in shrill horror. "A private secretary with practically no means of his own." "But it would have been a severe blow to you," I said. "Now, Mrs. Ackroyd, I've got a message for you from Hercule Poirot." "For me?" Mrs. Ackroyd looked quite alarmed. I hastened to reassure her, and I explained what Poirot wanted. "Certainly," said Mrs. Ackroyd rather doubtfully. "I suppose we must come if Mr. Poirot says so. But what is it all about? I'd like to know beforehand." I assured the lady truthfully that I myself did not know any more than she did. "Very well," said Mrs. Ackroyd at last, rather grudgingly, "I will tell the others, and we will be there at 9 o'clock. Thereupon I took my leave, and joined Poirot at the agreed meeting place. "I've been longer than a quarter of an hour, I'm afraid," I remarked. "But once that good lady starts talking, it's a matter of the utmost difficulty to get a word in edgeways." "It is of no matter," said Poirot. "Me, I have been well amused. This park is magnificent." We set off homewards. When we arrived, to our great surprise, Caroline, who had evidently been watching for us, herself opened the door. She put her fingers to her lips. Her face was full of importance and excitement. "Ursula Bourne," she said, "the parlor maid from Fernley. She's here. I've put her in the dining room. She's in a terrible way, poor thing. Says she must see Poirot at once. I've done all I could. Taken her a cup of hot tea. It really goes to one's heart to see anyone in such a state." "In the dining room?" asked Poirot. "So this way," I said, and flung open the door. Ursula Bourne was sitting by the table. Her arms were spread out in front of her, and she had evidently just lifted her head from where it had been buried. Her eyes were red with weeping. "Ursula Bourne," I murmured. But Poirot went past me with outstretched hands. "No," he said, "that is not quite right, I think. It is not Ursula Bourne, is it, my child, but Ursula Peyton. Mrs. Ralph Peyton." This concludes the 6th part of 7 total of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.